I'm Alan Thorpe.
And I'm David Rogers, and together we host the WeatherPod.
In each episode, we invite a leading expert to help investigate how public, private, and academic sectors can work together to produce weather information of value to business and society.
Timely, accurate, and focused weather information and related services have enormous value across all areas of human activity.
It can increase the efficiency and profitability of business, help save lives and improve safety on land, at sea and in the air, and predict the spread of life-threatening diseases.
Now, as climate change increases the frequency and impact of extreme weather events, weather information is crucial to build social and economic resilience. In this special Asia Climate Forum edition of the WeatherPod, Alan Thorpe and I have invited Dale Barker, the Director of the Centre for Climate Research Singapore, and Thomas Reindl, the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore, to discuss decarbonisation, renewable energy and hydrometeorological services. Alan, over to you.
Thanks, David. I'd like to open our discussion by taking a look at how you see your own organisation's work feeding into the drive for global decarbonisation. In particular, I think the need for better hydrometeorological services and more accurate forecasts is going to increase as society takes more steps towards decarbonising the economy. I suppose the key reason is that as economies adopt more renewable, sustainable technologies and processes, they become increasingly sensitive to weather across many sectors. Of course, this is further exacerbated by climate change. Dale, could I start with you, please? What do you see as the main challenges being faced in decarbonising Singapore? And how does the Centre for Climate Research Singapore contribute to that? And when it comes to improving climate information, where are the gaps or shortcomings in the science and technology that need addressing?
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, so in terms of the decarbonising Singapore, of course, we are here in the deep tropics, a relatively small part of the world. And in terms of carbon emissions, Singapore overall is a relatively small contribution to the overall total. But in terms of decarbonising, we don't necessarily have some of the mitigations or the solutions that others can bring in. So, for example, renewable energy. In the deep tropics, of course, wind energy, which is a big part of it. It's a small place, so we don't have too much space for solar, although of course we'll hear more about the fact that we are working in solar, but it's a relatively small place, so it's really a regional dependency and a regional solution when it comes to decarbonisation. I mean, in terms of CCRS's role, our goal is to do research in what we call the underpinning climate science, and also how that underpinning research on understanding and predicting how the climate system will evolve, how that is then going to impact on agencies and governments and the public's actions and decision making. And so how we contribute to that process is of course through science, through both weather forecasting. So, for example, we are interested in predicting the weather for the next 30 minutes. Which is on the sort of weather impact side, where do they send the flood teams to, for example, but also way out beyond that, all the way out to the next 50 or 100 years. And of course, that's more about understanding the way the future climate will evolve. And in particular, one of the big projects that we have at the moment is to essentially run what we call regional climate projections. So you're probably familiar with the IPCC, the global climate model projections. Well, of course, Singapore is a very small place. And so what we want to do is take those large-scale climate projections for the next 100 years and really hone down into the impacts on the Singapore region. So climate modeling is a big part of what we do. So and weather forecasting. So I'd suggest that they're the priorities for us.
That's interesting, Dale. I wanted to follow up on actually the last point you mentioned, which is obviously if we're talking about global climate models, they're relatively low resolution and on a large grid scale, certainly compared to the city-state the size of Singapore, where clearly there's going to be need for much higher resolution. I just wonder how do you deal with that interface between coarse grain information from climate models and what you need at the scale of the city?
Yeah, so thanks, Howard. It's a good question. So there are various approaches to this, but in terms of our climate modeling, what we're doing is essentially creating a nest, what we call a limited area model. And it's nested within the large scale global models. Of course, it has to the local has to feed in, get the large scales from the globe, and we do that on both weather and climate timescales. So, for example, on the weather timescales, we're running our models at around 1 kilometer grid spacing, whereas in weather prediction, the best global weather prediction systems in the world, such as the European Weather Centre, are running around 9, soon to be 5 kilometer. So what we're doing is we're taking those global grids and global science and those projections and going down to kilometer scale. And on the climate side too, of course, the climate models need to run over hundreds of years and thousands of scenarios. And so they can't necessarily afford to run at even the 5-10 kilometer grid spacing. So it's an even bigger challenge on the climate change timescales.
Thomas, could I turn to you? And I'd like to know a bit more about how you see the Solar Energy Research Institute fitting into the decarbonisation process in Singapore and elsewhere for that matter, and what technological developments are taking place to improve the effectiveness of renewables like solar and wind.
Yeah, thank you very much. So SERIS, the Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore, which is part of the National University of Singapore. We are Singapore's National Institute for Applied Solar Research, and we develop novel technologies along the full value chain from solar cells, modules, all the way to systems. But we don't stop there. We also think about how to safely and reliably integrate solar, which is variable in nature, safely and reliably integrate this into electric power grids. And so the whole discussion about decarbonization is it's at the core of our activities, because decarbonization on a global scale only makes sense. And decarbonization in many areas will lead to electrification of many sectors. And this electrification only makes sense if it comes from renewable energies. And this electrification has to happen across various sectors. For electricity, for sure, meaning the move from fossil fuels to renewables. But we also have to look into transportation, like the move over to electric vehicles, heating wherever it's necessary, using heat pumps, for example, instead of burning fuels to heat up water. And we also have to look into various industry sectors in the chemical, steel, and other heavy industries. And most of the lifting will be done by wind and solar. And if you look at the outcomes of the Glasgow conference and other experts, it's very obvious that we have to get our act together in the next 10 years. The next 10 years will be decisive for which degree scenario we are looking at, whether it's 1.5, 2, or even more. And for the next 10 years, we cannot wait for technologies which may be developed now and may be ready in 2030 or more. We have to use technologies which are ready, and the ones which are able today to do the heavy lifting is wind and solar. But both, of course, are variable in nature, and in order to safely and reliably integrate it into power grid and have them available also at times when there's no wind and there's less irradiance, or maybe at nighttime, we need to accurately be able to forecast the power output of the various variable renewables. And that's where climate science and solar forecasting play a major role, and there will be much, much more in the future.
What's the current percentage of energy provided by solar at the moment?
Globally, it's about 3%, and we just surpassed just a few weeks ago. We surpassed a major milestone in solar deployment, which is 1 terawatt peak of installed capacity. So the whole world now has 1 terawatt peak of installed solar capacity. It took 40 years to get there. But the interesting part is it only takes another, say, 4 years likely to add another terawatt. So that's also striking for the renewables, how fast you can deploy them, and especially solar. There's probably more than 200 gigawatts of solar will be deployed this year, which is around about 18 gigawatts per month. Wow. Which is like 18 major power stations will be deployed every month alone this year, which would take, say, a few years for conventional, or if you talk about nuclear, it will probably take 15 years for each of those 1 gigawatts.
Thanks. I'd like to move us on to a related area, if I may, and a key area we explore in the WeatherPod often is the value of cooperation, and that involves cooperation between the public, the private and the academic sectors of the weather enterprise, both nationally, regionally and internationally. Dale, I was interested to know how you see the value of such cooperation to the work you do. I mean, for example, we know that cooperation with national meteorological services, obviously in your case the Meteorological Service Singapore, is important, and also with meteorological services internationally and regionally. So I wonder, how does such cooperation work for you, and what are the benefits as you see them for and with the organisations you work with?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So I guess the first a couple of things to start with. I mean, of course, the climate system is interconnected globally, so one is forced to work, to understand the global climate system, to understand where you are, whether it be in the next 5 days or the next 100 years. So in that sense, we are forced by the science of the system that we have to work together. And of course, today's weather in Europe was last week's weather in North America. So, those global models are vital. And the observation network, of course, which is probably one of the biggest successes maybe of the global weather climate community over the past decades, is that international exchange of data, because we all depend on each other. We can't do a 5-day forecast if we've just got observations at our local place. So, we have to work together. I think the other thing I'd say is that, the complexity of what we're trying to do is enormous. In terms of the need to understand how the weather works, the clouds, the oceans, the ocean currents, the impacts of salinity, and the impacts of the ocean and the atmosphere and the land working together. This region is called the Maritime Continent. It's in the name. It's in the name that the sea and the oceans and the land and also the atmosphere, of course, are highly interconnected. So we have to work together across disciplines. And we have to work together because we cannot use simple models. These models are highly complicated, millions of lines of code, which require significant amount of computing resource to produce weather forecasts. So we don't everybody want to be doing this. We couldn't afford it. So it's absolutely essential that we work together.
Thomas, can I ask you the same kind of question? Obviously, you work in a different domain, the technology domain. And so I'm very interested to know how does cooperation work there, and what do you see as the main benefits to you and your partners of any cooperation that happens, and to what extent is it how wide and far does the cooperation go? Does it span different sectors and regions?
Yeah, we certainly rely a lot on collaborations across the world. We work in different parts of the value chain, and there's different types of collaborations. But specifically in the area of solar forecasting, which is one of the key areas we are working on, this is where we clearly need the inputs from the Met services and from the climate research, because I would say we were born as solar people, but we were not born as meteorologists. So we need to work together and give each other strength, because this area of what you call energy metrology, meaning applying meteorological scientific methodologies in order to predict the outcome or the generation pattern and resources for variable renewables, be it wind and solar. This is ever growing in this growth of renewable energies.
So a sort of related follow-up is you've talked about the link to Met services, Met information, but what about across the industry in terms of different companies that are looking at renewable energy provision? Is there, to what extent is there the ability to share best practice and to generate new ideas collectively?
Yeah, the need for the correct data from observations is important along the entire value chain of a renewable energy project. That already starts with site selection, when you need to know whether your place has sufficient wind or sufficient irradiance to make your business case viable in the first place. And then it goes all the way down to operations. And during operations, forecasting is very critical from two perspectives. One is to maximize your output, because if you have a large solar farm, and I happen to have the privilege to visit one of the largest solar farms in the world, which was a project in China, 850 megawatts. It takes you half an hour by car to drive from one end to the other. Wow. And that system alone, you have different irradiance and different cloud patterns on different parts of the solar farm, because it's just by the sheer size of the solar farm. And in addition, as I mentioned earlier, we have to look into a safe and reliable integration of variable solar power and wind power into electric power grids.
Right. So Thomas, a key issue that we often discuss in the WeatherPod, and particularly at the moment when we're looking at renewable energy and decarbonisation and the new economy, is what is the need for detailed, accurate, consistent hydromet data? I mean, we assume that from our professional side, but it's not necessarily so obvious, how that information is being used and will be used within the sort of renewable energy system. And I'd like you to tell us a bit about your solar forecasting system and how that is actually operating, and how you actually, what you need to make that work within the context of Singapore.
Yeah, so our solar forecasting project, that requires us to forecast irradiance over different time horizons and irradiance across the entire island of Singapore. And time horizons we are looking at are anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 7 hours ahead, all the way to 14 days ahead. And this is largely for managing the energy market in Singapore, but eventually also with an increasing share also to manage the power grid accordingly. Now, as we already talked about, Singapore is in the tropics, and forecasting weather patterns and cloud patterns over short and medium time horizons is extremely complicated. We basically need to forecast anything that blocks or reduces the amount of sunlight reaching a solar panel, which is in typically clouds, but there could also be transboundary haze from forest fires, which we also have analyzed some time ago. But what we really need as an observation is irradiance data. And when we started this 10 years ago, we were knocking all doors in town to get high spatial resolve irradiance data, which we couldn't find because most of the Met services, of course, for weather forecast, you need to know, we as human beings, we want to know whether it rains and what temperature, how hot it's going to get, but not how much irradiance we will have, because we as human beings, it doesn't really matter whether you have 850 or 600 watts per square meter irradiance. So the sun intensity is, for the normal weather forecasting, not so relevant, but for solar power, it's the key parameter. So what we started out is then to build a sensor, our own sensor network of irradiance sensors in about 5 times 5 kilometer grid across the entire island, which we have now developed into a live irradiance map. So at any given point in time, we know the intensity of the sun onto Singapore, and that's then the base to forecast the same spatial resolution over different time horizons. But again, only one set of data will not help. So we complement this with numerical weather prediction data, which we partly get from CCRS, which is our collaboration partner. We work with satellite data providers, where we also get quite high resolution data, every time resolution, every 10 minutes or so. So we need a whole set of different datas, and then we make forecasts on the different data sets. And then, as it was mentioned earlier, we use machine learning in order to filter out the best and most optimum forecast for the different time horizons. And that's where our almost 10 years of observation come in, because machine learning only works properly if you have a large historical data set where you can train certain models.
Is these techniques being applied in other places, outside of Singapore?
Yeah, for our system, which is now really operational, and that's I also want to highlight this, that this is fundamentally different. Whether you do a little bit of forecasting on an historical data set, or whether you run this in a real life operational system. And we have developed this. It's currently being trialed in the Power System Operations Center here at EMA in Singapore. And once this has been properly tested and implemented, which is expected by the end of the year, then this will become an integral part of the power system operation in Singapore. And from there, this is obviously would be a strong reference point for our development. From there, we can then start knocking doors for other utilities, but also for asset owners who want to have forecasting for their solar generation.
Thanks.
I'd like to move us on to another topic, if I may, and that is about air pollution and air quality. And Dale, perhaps I can ask you about CCRS. I know that it does air quality modelling to investigate the effects of various types of pollution in the urban environment, and then to go on to produce air quality forecasts. I suppose I'm particularly interested in where you think the main gaps in both the data that are needed and the science that is needed, and what do you think are the best ways of filling those gaps? And I suppose a related point would be, do you think that the international efforts, such as, say, the Copernicus Atmospheric Monitoring Service, are valuable to your work, and how would you use that?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Yeah, so on the air quality approach, we've I guess we've been looking at that in CCRS for a number of years now. I think initially it was more about regional air quality, in terms of the sort of cross-boundary biomass burning, and in terms of data. I mean, the satellite data has been immense for to provide us information, and the improvements in satellite data over the past 10 years have been immense to see the bigger picture in terms of not just haze, of course, but aerosol optical depth. But also, for example, there are a variety of sources of air quality, air pollution in the region. And for example, volcanic ash, we don't necessarily get too much of that here. But again, in terms of satellite data providing information on the height of the plume, and the hot spots in forest fires, for example, that's huge. So I guess that's where that's a collaboration across Southeast Asia through what is the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center, ASMC, which is hosted by the Met Service Singapore, and that's something we provide products on the web every day for, and I think that's a real success. But in terms of air quality, and specifically honing in on Singapore, then you're starting to get into obviously very complex chemical reactions between the various constituents, whether it be the particulates, PM 2.5, PM 10, ozone, and other oxides, etc. So and I think that the challenge in terms of the data and the science, of course, the science is certainly challenging, because this is typically a very hot place, urban environment. The path of the chemical reactions that lead to the different concentrations of air quality is probably different here from somewhere, it might be London or Beijing, because the concentrations, the pathways through the chemical reactions are probably different. So I think there's a real exciting science actually to be done to better understand, how air quality is in Singapore. And I think this is very much almost like a city. The chemical reactions are sort of well known, but how the weightings apply to each of the different species is a real challenge, and that's certainly something that we're working on. And in terms of data, of course, you want the observations of air quality, and that's often a street level thing. So there's issues of what we call representativity. If your instrument's next to a bus that's parked at the bus stop, then you're not going to get a representative view of what the true air quality is across the whole district. So there's some issues for the data and the science.
Could I turn to Thomas and staying in the urban environment, but again, this is also about the uncertainty. So, there's a challenge, obviously, in the tropics. You have a high variability of power generation due to cloud cover, and I'm assuming also due to air pollution. How does your solar forecasting system work when it comes to predicting cloud cover and the impact of air quality? And also, I'm very interested to know how the market is structured, or how it will be structured to utilize that kind of information.
Yeah, by the way, the one beauty of these hefty tropical rainfalls is that they clean the solar panels and they move away quickly. So this is something very often in the European context, it rains for a whole day or for 2 days in a row, which we hardly have here at all. But we have these heftier rainfalls, and then they clean the solar panels, and if then the sun comes out, just nice, because then you have more intense, you have clearer skies. So there's also a beauty, as long as it doesn't rain for ages, of course. As I mentioned earlier, we have to predict anything that is between the extraterrestrial irradiance and the solar panel, and that's typically clouds. It actually starts even before the clouds. We have so much turbidity and so much humidity in the air here in the tropics that if you blow away all the clouds, if you look at the clear sky model for Singapore, it doesn't even get you the 1,000 watts per square meter, which is the standard when you measure a solar panel. There's an international technical standard how you measure solar panels, and that uses 1,000 watts per square meter of sun intensity. In Singapore, the clear sky model doesn't even get there. It's about 950 watts per square meter. So in principle, you don't even get what you paid for, just from the sheer moisture which is in the air, not even talking about the clouds. Now, the air pollution, which you mentioned earlier, luckily Singapore is rather clean compared to other mega cities in the world. But nevertheless, there is air pollution in general. But then for haze in particular, we did a very detailed study on the 2013 haze event, which was one of these transboundary haze from forest fires in nearby countries. And what we observed there was that a PSI of about 200 would reduce the output of the solar power systems here by 15%. So it is a sizable impact, what we would get from this haze. This was actually quite an interesting, was a scientific problem, because during haze events, you still have clouds. And so you have to very sophisticatedly separate the impact of clouds from that, what is actual haze and what would have been there anyway, because it would have been cloudy on that day or in that observation. So that was an interesting science aspect. But luckily, we didn't have much haze in the last few years. So leaving us with the forecasts of the clouds and the Sumatran squall, what Dale mentioned earlier, that would be a beautiful one to project, because they can be seen moving across the island very nicely with a very rather sharp front. But it can be very devastating for solar power output, because it moves across the island, probably takes about 30, 40 minutes to cover the entire island. But then the typical rain cloud it brings along with are very thick, and they reduce the solar output. If you have like the 950 before, it would go down to below 200, maybe even 100 watts per square meter. So within 45 minutes, if you have, say, a gigawatt of solar power, which is probably 1/7 of the total power generation in Singapore, within, say, 40 minutes, you would switch off a significant portion of your power generation. So that's where the impact is very measurable. There's typical variabilities are in lower magnitudes, but they're still there. And they are definitely measurable in time frames of, say, 30 minutes, because 30 minutes, this is the energy market closing time frame. So Singapore has a free, completely liberalized energy market. So there are conventional power gencos, generation companies, they run power stations, and they have to bid every 30 minutes, they have to bid into the energy market, and then there's a merit order effect, and the one who bids the lowest price will get to serve the electricity in the following half-hour cycle. Now, with a small share of solar, this doesn't really make an impact, but with an increasing share of solar, and solar not being dispatchable, we have to take the load forecast, which is also being generated in half-hour increments, and then take away what is going to be generated from solar, and only the delta of that needs to be provided by the generation companies. And there is a certain level of accuracy required, because any ups and downs or unforeseen ups and downs in the energy market, they need to be provided by reserves, and reserves tend to be much, much more expensive than the conventional energy, electricity.
Do you see opportunity for more smart use, so that when you look at you basically alter the load, but in response based on the forecast, so that you're getting people to reduce their use wherever they can for short periods of time, and reducing air conditioning output, and so on. Is that happening?
Yes, so we are looking at that as well. So there's demand management, because whenever we have less solar, the classic reaction would be to increase the power output of a gas-fired power plant, for example. But you may as well, as you mentioned, you may as well reduce your load, especially with air conditioning. And air conditioning is a great opportunity for Singapore, because 15% of all the electricity which we use here goes actually into air conditioning. But many of the large air conditioning systems are water-based, so they use cold water. So if you have less irradiance because there are clouds moving over your solar installations, then you may as well switch off your air conditioning system and reduce your power demand, because you have quite a sizable thermal inertia which you can ride on, because there is already a tank with cold water which can then provide for another 30-40 minutes. And only then, when the clouds have moved away, you can switch on your air conditioning. So this would work for reducing solar irradiance by clouds. But then if the clouds move away and suddenly you may have too much and excess energy, there's also great opportunities for Singapore how to deal with excess energy, because one of the large loads in Singapore is, for example, desalination plants. So when you have excess solar power, you, instead of curtailing it or not using it, you may as well run desalination plants at a higher rate, and then you store the excess power in fresh water, basically. So sector coupling also makes an awful lot of sense for managing the solar irradiance.
I mean, you give, I think, a really fantastic example of really the use of forecasting in a very active and dynamic way in managing the energy situation in a country. Thank you.
Indeed. Unfortunately, it's time to draw to a close, and it just remains for me to say thank you so much to Dale and Thomas for joining us for today's discussion. It really has been an extremely interesting conversation.
Yeah, indeed, and also from me, many thanks for joining us on this special Asia Climate Forum WeatherPod from Singapore and sharing your really valuable insights. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
My great pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Well, that concludes this special episode of the WeatherPod, prepared for Asia Climate Forum 2022. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to hear more episodes of the WeatherPod or have any ideas for future episodes, then please visit www.gweforum.org or email us at support@gweforum.org.